Chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Mr. Speaker, on Saturday, the 7th of November, the Nassau Guardian quoted words from the Anglican Bishop of Nassau in the Bahamas and reported the following. The Anglican bishop expressed concern about the number of so-called white-collar jobs that are being done by non-Bahamians, who he said are similarly undocumented and unregularized. Some very large entities are guilty of this and seem to commit infraction after infraction without penalty, without naming any person or entity. Some appear untouchable and some are. I cry shame and call on the government and the Department of Immigration to do its work without fear or favor across the board, and I beg higher powers not to interfere. Then the Nassau Guardian wrote an editorial on the 9th of November under the headline, "Be Just and Fair, Minister Mitchell," and wrote inter alia the following. We therefore support Boyd's message and call on Mitchell to be fair and just. Our laws must be respected in their totality, otherwise the enforcement becomes nothing more than a tool to perpetrate injustice. I wish, Mr. Speaker, to express at the outset a distinction between my approach to the Bishop's comments and those of the Nassau Guardian. I thought the Bishop's comments were a thoughtful approach to a delicate subject which requires public discussion and erudition. Unfortunately, those comments were then used to create a bit of mischief, which I am forced to clarify. This is because the way it is written, it casts an unfortunate personal imputation on me as a minister of the government, and I must respond. Once I saw the headline and read the editorial, I reached out to the Nassau Guardian and asked the question, where is the evidence that the laws are being enforced unfairly or unjustly by this minister? The operative words being, by Minister Mitchell. I submit, sir, there is no evidence that Fred Mitchell perpetrated unfairness or injustice in carrying out my duties as a Minister of Immigration or in any other public position, and none can be found. And I'm not talking, Mr. Speaker, about the wild and crazy talk of activists with an axe to grind, but unfairness and injustice in an objective sense. May I take some time, Mr. Speaker, to explain what I understand the law of the Bahamas to be with regard to citizenship of the Bahamas. The case Ryan and the Attorney General decided in 1980 was a seminal case in administrative law across the Commonwealth. It was a Bahamian case, and one which I know very well and used many times in my practice as a lawyer. I did not leave those lessons behind when I began to work for the government. The case solemnized the duty to act fairly in the law of citizenship of the Bahamas. The Bahamas Nationality Act and the Constitution mandates who can and cannot become a citizen of the Bahamas and how you apply. Those applications are to be processed scrupulously and in as timely a fashion as our present procedures and systems permit. In other words, as I understand it, the role of the minister in these matters is to receive the application, examine whether the individual meets the criteria set down in the Constitution and the Bahamas Nationality Act, and if the person meets the criteria, that person should be granted citizenship of the Bahamas. The exceptions are if there is something of a criminal or moral nature which would vitiate the right which arises in law. That has been my approach, and I have not deviated from it. That is the ratio, as I understand it, of Ryan and the Attorney General, the governing case in the matter. The practice has evolved by convention in this country that minister in the statute law means the cabinet, and the final adjudication on these matters therefore sits with the cabinet. From a time point of view, the question is, how often can you get before a cabinet and how many applications can be considered at a time. I assure you, not many times and not often. The procedures have not changed in 42 years. It is unlikely to change so long as the Bahamian people believe that their representatives ought to have some input into who becomes a citizen of the Bahamas or a permanent resident. Many have suggested administrative reforms which would remove the Cabinet's input, but these have not been accepted, nor do they seem at this point to be politically saleable. The wider difficulty is that you are unable to have a dispassionate public conversation about this without it disintegrating into a nasty row. The Lord Bishop referenced the Citizenship Commission, and I welcome the appointment of such a commission. Perhaps that is the better way to deal with this, because in formulating new public policy on these matters, the policymakers run the risk of moving faster ahead and further ahead than the people of the country are prepared to go, with drastic consequences as an end result. As I move around the country, the subject of immigration engenders strong views, logical and illogical, often overwrought with emotion. This is not something, therefore, that can be led by the minister responsible for immigration and citizenship. The minister is the keeper of the system, its guardian, and not, in this instance, its reformer. The matter of discussion on reform, in this instance, is a matter for civil society. So I invite the Lord Bishop to lead the discussion on immigration. I invite him to bring his church membership and the wider community of faith from across the denominations along with him so that meaningful consensus could be had in charting the way forward for our country. At the same time, I am sympathetic to the problem of delay. This has not remained unaddressed either. I've spoken to the issue of resources for the Department of Immigration and the lack thereof. I've also spoken to the need for us to be realistic as a people and a country about what we can afford given the resources that we have that are scarce. In response to the complaints from the public, I've moved the government to commit itself to an $18 million package of new equipment which will be rolled out over the next 5 years to improve the application processes for all immigration issues and should allow people to track where their applications are and just where these matters are in the process. I've urged my colleagues to deal with these matters as a matter of routine. If we simply do our duty in a routine, dispassionate fashion week by week, or when time permits, then the question of procedural unfairness might fall away. And all of these have been accepted by the government. There are other practical issues to consider. One of them is being able to identify an individual who is eligible for citizenship of the Bahamas. Last year, for example, all applications had to be returned to the Registrar General's office, who applied based on birth in the Bahamas, because the validity of the Bahamian birth certificates was questioned. This continues to be an issue, and so all birth certificates are checked with the Registrar General's office to ensure that they are genuine. Secondly, I wish to assure the Lord Bishop and the Nassau Guardian that under this minister there is no double standard in the application of the law. The butcher, the banker, the candlestick maker are equally subject to the law. And the public evidence supports this. What I recall, however, is that the press response to the application of the law is a double standard where, when the person who breaks the law comes from the north of us, one rule applies in terms of publicity and sympathy. Where the man or woman comes from the south of us, another rule applies. All you have to do is remember when the Department of Immigration carried out routine operations which resulted in interdictions of a banker and an employee of Atlantis, the difference in the response from elites to those incidents when compared to the routine checks which those interdicts got when it involved people from the laboring classes. Right now, we are awaiting a ruling in a case in Freeport which we hope will clarify the powers of immigration officers to exclude someone from the Bahamas. I beg the critics, please, do not get me mixed up in these prejudices and prejudicial cleavages in the society as a whole. I have none of those. Anyone who breaks the law is subject to the rules of immigration. And if by higher power who might interfere it refers to the minister, I beg to differ. I have never done so, and I will not do so. And if you have the evidence to the contrary, please produce it. If the Bahamian people wish to move to a system which is devoid of the input of political decision makers, like some developed countries, then that perhaps is a genuine discussion we can have. But this minister, in this present system, does his work without fear or favor and applies the law in that manner, and I do not want it hanging out there that I am the perpetrator of procedural or other unfairness toward applicants. Those who are entitled are advanced. When the cabinet time permits, they are adjudicated upon, and that is that. If the Guardian has evidence that I personally work some unfairness on any applicant, they are welcome to produce it. Now, Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank the Lord Bishop for his comments, and I will reach out to him personally. I am, after all, one of his members, and I have the utmost and deepest respect for him. That is all I have to say in this matter at this time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Order that the communication be brought up. And order that the communication do lie on the table. Further statements and communication by ministers. Chair recognizes Honourable Member for Fox Hill.
Mr. Speaker, there were statements in the press over the past week in connection with the Remembrance Day services at the Cathedral and the Cenotaph. Today is Armistice Day, the 11th of November, which marks the end of the First World War. Thus, Remembrance Sunday was held observing the date and recalling those who died in the First World War and in the Second World War, or who saw service in those wars. Amongst them, there were a number of Bahamian men and women. Their comrades, now sadly few in number, but no less important, remain with us today. On Sunday last, I had a conversation with a young voter about the relevance of Remembrance Day. It meant nothing to him. He didn't know what we were remembering and asked me, what is it that we are remembering? But I told him it might help him if he took a visit to the Nassau Public Library and saw the pictures of the young men who set off for service from the Bahamas in the First World War. They were young men just like he is today, some of them 18, 19, 20, and they put their lives on the line. Similarly, in the Second World War, the fight against fascism was joined by young men and women from this country. Had the fascists succeeded, they intended to make sure that we in this dispensation would not be free. It was a real sacrifice on the part of those who went. Then I asked them to remember the 4 young men cut down in the flower of their youth when the Royal Bahamas Defense Force was only 6 weeks old on the 10th of May, 1980. Cuban MiGs sunk the HMBS Flamingo and strafed the water around Ragged Island, and Fenwick Stirrup, Austin Smith, Edward Williams, and David Tucker were never seen again. They were lost at sea and are presumed dead. The Cuban President Raul Castro, just this year, apologized to our Prime Minister in person for the regrettable mistake which was made in sinking that ship and the death of those men. And we remembered those from the wars and those 4 young men who died in 1980. I wish then to respond to the complaints of the veterans about the lack of sensitivity and disrespect shown to them in connection with the protocol arrangements at the Cathedral and wider issues with regard to their pensions. I spoke at length with their representative on Sunday and indicated that at the first opportunity I would address this with the government. I did so yesterday, and I am pleased to report that with regard to the issue of the shortfall in the monies for the pension for this year, The government has agreed to make up that shortfall subject to an agreement on the amounts owed. As national protocol arrangements come under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I wish to offer on this occasion my deep regret at the avoidable confusion over the arrangements for the church service, and will seek to make amends by ensuring that greater sensitivity is exercised going forward into the future. Mr. Speaker, I wish to say to all those who saw service and who continue to serve this country, we offer again the thanks of the government on behalf of a grateful nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Ordered that the communication be brought up. And order that the communication do lie on the table. Further statements and communication by ministers. Member for Fox Hill.
I believe there's a service being conducted by the veterans today at Bethel Baptist Church at 11, and a representative from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is going to attend. I've asked the parliamentary secretary in the circumstances of this of the House meeting to attend the service.
Thank you, Honourable Member.